The Victim, A Romance of the Real, Jefferson Davis, by Thomas Frederick Dixon, Jr. Thomas Dixon was born in Shelby, North Carolina on January 11, 1864. He was one of 8 children, of whom 5 survived to adulthood. He had an older brother named Amzie Clarence Dixon, who was a Baptist minister, authored a book called The Fundamentals, a series of articles and volumes influential later in fundamentalist Christianity. And he was a well-respected minister in his time. His younger brother, Frank Dixon, was also a preacher and lecturer, and Thomas Frederick Dixon himself was a very famous Baptist minister during his entire lifetime. He was from a very famous family in that part of North Carolina. His father and his uncle, Colonel Leroy McAfee, after the Civil War, both joined the Klan during the Reconstruction period, and his uncle was very famous for his involvement over this. And Dixon, as a child, remembered them during the early Reconstruction period when North Carolina was politically in turmoil. He remembered his uncle and father going out and doing this. And years later, after stability was restored to the state of North Carolina and the South as a whole, Dixon, as an adult, wanted to memorialize this time period. And so, in addition to many different books that he wrote various takes on Christianity. He wrote many different sermons. He wrote a whole bunch of sermons. He wrote many other things. Now, his most famous books, his most famous series was the Reconstruction series. Okay. In 1902, he wrote the book The Leopard's Spots, A Romance of the White Man's Burden. That was part 1 of the trilogy on Reconstruction. And during the time he was writing the Reconstruction trilogy, he was also writing a trilogy on socialism. And he wrote a book between The Leopard's Spots and The Clansman. It was called The One Woman, A Story of Modern Utopia, part 1 of the trilogy on socialism. And then in 1905, which was 3 years after he wrote The Leopard's Spots, he followed it up with The Clansman. And 2 years later, he followed that up with The Traitor, A Story of the Fall of the Invisible Empire. Now, he would also do another book in his he finished his attacks on socialism, and then later he did a book called The Sins of the Father, A Romance of the South, which was about mixed race marriages and relationships. And in 1913, he did 3 novels on who he called Southern heroes. His first book was The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Abraham Lincoln. The second book was The Victim, A Romance of the Real Jefferson Davis. And later, in 1921, he would do The Man in Gray, A Romance of the North and South, a book about General Robert E. Lee. 3 novels on Southern heroes. He was very into writing about the history of the South, and he gave lectures during his life all over the South. Thomas Dixon is one of the characters who, of this time period between about 1890 and the Great Depression, was one of the very, very famous people in the South. I wouldn't say he was ever as famous as Douglas Southall Freeman or anybody like that, but he was very famous in this early era. But because of the Great Depression and then the Second World War, the rise of Nazism in Europe, Thomas Dixon sort of became, shall we say, persona non grata in Hollywood, and he found himself slowly being pushed out of the Baptist church and other things. And at the end of his life, I believe he had suffered a stroke and was in ill health for a number of years before his death in 1946. But this book, The Victim, after he had finished his book on Abraham Lincoln, he had immediately set to work on doing a book about President Jefferson Davis, the only president of the Confederacy. It is ironic that when Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were both in office during the war between the states, both men had been born in Kentucky, not very far from one another. Now, when you open this book, it shows a picture on the side, and it said, "The man in front gave a short laugh and advanced on the girl," page 300. That's one of the pictures of the Union soldiers, I believe, entering the house, and I believe they're looking for Jefferson Davis. And it said, copyright 1914 by Thomas Dixon, dedication to the brave who died for what they believed to be right. Fold up the banners, smelt the guns, love rules, her gentle purpose runs. A mighty mother turns in tears the pages of her battle years, lamenting all her father's fallen sons, written by a man named Thompson. To the reader, in the historical romance of which I have woven, of the dramatic events of the life of Jefferson Davis, I have drawn his real character, unobscured by passion or prejudice, forced by his people to lead their cause. His genius created an engine of war, so terrible in its power that through it, 5 million Southerners, without money, without a market, without credit, withstood for 4 years the shock of 20 million men of their own blood and of equal daring, backed by boundless resources. The achievement is without a parallel in history and adds a new glory to the records of our race. The scenes have all been drawn from authentic records in my possession. I have not at any point taken a liberty with an essential detail of history. Thomas Dixon. So here we go. Here's the prologue. The victim. Prologue. Kidnapped. The hot sun of the South was sinking in red glow through the giant treetops of a Mississippi forest beyond the village of Woodville. A slender girl stood in the pathway watching a boy of 7 trudge manfully away beside his stalwart brother. Her lips trembled and eyes filled with tears. "Wait, wait," she cried. "Don't, Polly, you hurt," the little fellow faltered, looking at her with a feeling of sudden fear. "Why did you squeeze me so hard?" "You shouldn't have done that, honey," the big brother frowned. "I know," the sister pleaded, "but I couldn't help it." "What are you crying about?" the boy questioned. Again the girl's arm stole around his neck. "What's the matter with her, big brother?" he asked with a brave attempt at scorn. The man slowly loosened the sister's arms. "I'm just going home with you, ain't I?" the child went on with a quiver in his voice. The older brother led him to a fallen log, sat down, and held his hand. "No, boy," he said quietly. "I'd as well tell you the truth now. I'm going to send you to Kentucky to a wonderful school taught by learned men from the old world, wise monks who know everything. You want to go to a real school, don't you?" "But my mama don't know." "That's just it, boy. We can't tell her. She wouldn't let you go." "Why?" "Well, she's a good Baptist, and it's a long, long way to the St. Thomas Monastery." "How far?" 1,000 miles through these big woods." The blue eyes dimmed. "I want to see my mama before I go." His voice broke. The man shook his head. "No, boy, it won't do. You're her baby." The dark head sank with a cry. "I want to see her." Come, Jeff Davis. You're going to be a soldier. Remember, you're the son of a soldier who fought under General Washington and won our freedom. You're named after Thomas Jefferson, the great president. Your 3 brothers have just come home from New Orleans. Under Old Hickory, we drove the British back to their ships and sent them flying home to England. The son of a soldier, the brother of soldiers. Can't cry." "I will if I want to." "All right," the man laughed. "I'll hold my hat and you can cry it full." He removed his hat and held it smilingly under the boy's firm little chin. The childish lips tightened and the cheeks flushed with anger. His bare toes began to dig holes in the soft, rich earth. The appeal to his soldier blood had struck into the pride of his heart. In the insult of a hat full of tears, it hurt. At last he found his tongue. "Does Pa know I'm going?" "Yes. He thinks you're a very small boy to go so far, but he knows it's for the best." "That's why he kissed me when I left?" "Yes." "I thought it was funny," he murmured with half a sob. "He never kissed me before." "He's quiet and reserved, boy, but he's wise and good and loves you. He's had a hard life out here in the wilderness fighting his way with a wife and 10 children. He never had a chance to get an education, and the children didn't either. Some of us are too old now. There's time for you. We're going to stand aside and let you pass. You're our baby brother, and we love you." The child's hand slowly stole into the rough one of the man. "And I love you, big brother," the little voice faltered, "and all the others, too. And that's why I'm not going." "I'm so glad." The girl clapped her hands and laughed. "Polly, Well, I am, and I don't care what you say. He's too little to go so far, and you know he is. The man grasped her hand and he whispered, Hush! The brother slipped his arm around the boy and drew him on his knees. He waited a moment until the hard lines at the corners of the firm mouth had relaxed under the pressure of his caress, pushed the tangled hair back from his forehead, and looked into the fine blue-gray eyes. His voice was tender and his speech slow. You must make up your mind to go, boy. I don't want to force you. I like to see your eyes flash when you say you won't go. You've got the stuff in you that real men are made of. That's why it's worthwhile to send you. I've seen that since you could toddle about the house and stamp your feet when things didn't suit you. Now listen to me. I've made a vow to God. I made a vow to God that you should have as good a chance as any man to make your way to the top. We're going to be the greatest nation in the world. I saw it in the red flash of the guns that day in New Orleans as I lay there in the trench and watched the long line of redcoats go down before us. Just a lot of raw recruits with old flintlocks, the men who charged us, the picked veterans of England's Grand Army. But we cut 'em to pieces, boy. I fired a cannon loaded with grape shot that mowed a lane straight through 'em. It must have killed 200 men. They burned our capital at Washington, and the Federalist traitors at Hartford were firing on us in the rear. But old Hickory showed the world that we could lick England with one hand tied behind our back, and we did it. We drove 'em like sheep, drove 'em into the sea. There's but one name on every lip in this country now, boy, and that's old Hickory. He'd be the president next time, but for one thing, just one thing, he didn't have a chance to learn when he was a boy. He's not educated. The brother paused, and a dreamy look came into his eyes. We may make him president anyhow, but if he'd been educated, there wouldn't be any if or but about it. Washington and Jefferson and Madison belonged to the rich and powerful class. Jackson is a yeoman like your father, but he'd be president, boy. If he'd been educated, nothing could stop him. Don't you see this is your country? This is a poor man's world. All you have to do is train your mind. You've got to do this. You understand? You've got to do this. The man paused suddenly and looked into the boy's wondering eyes. He had forgotten the child's rebellion. The young pioneer of the wilderness was talking to himself. Again he had seen a vision. He seized the boy's arms. Don't you see, boy? Don't you? The child's mouth hardened again. No, I don't. I'm just a little boy. I love my mama. She's good and sweet to me, and I'm not going to leave her. Again Polly laughed. A smile slowly played about the brother's lips and eyes. He must show his trump card. But you don't know what I've got for you. What? Something you've always wanted to have for your own. A pony? The man slowly rose. Come out to the big road. The boy seized his sister's hands. Polly, let's see. The girl's eyes grew dim. Oh, Jeff, I know you're going. No, we'll just see what it is. Come on. In 5 minutes they emerged from the deep woods into the clearing around a cabin. Beside the roadway stood a horse and pony, both bridled and saddled. The swift feet of the boy flew across the opening, the sister wide-eyed and trembling, close on his heels. He threw his arms around the pony's neck and stroked its head with a gentle touch. The pony pressed his mouth against the boy's cheek in friendly response. Don't you see him kiss me, Polly? Cried Trembling. Yes, I saw him, was the solemn response. Isn't he a beauty? Look, Polly, he's got a white spot on every foot and one on his forehead and black as coal all over. And oh, what a saddle! A red belt and red martingales. He touched the saddle lovingly and circled the pony's neck with his arm. The brother smiled again. Well, what do you think of that? The boy was trembling now from head to foot, his heart in his throat as he slowly asked, You mean that you'll give him to me for all my own? If you be a good boy, go to school and work hard, yes. All right, big brother, was the quick answer. I'll go. Help me on him and let me try him. The boy lifted his bare foot into the strong hand, sprang into the saddle, bounded down the road, wheeled, flew back, and leaped to the ground. He's a dandy. Polly dropped her head and started home, making a brave fight to keep back the tears. Halfway across the clearing, she gave up in a long, pitiful wail. The boy, busy with his pony, had not missed her. In a moment, he was by her side, his arms around her neck. Don't cry, Polly, honey. I'll be back before long, he pleaded. The only answer was a sob. Goodbye, Jeff. Her hand slowly slipped through his. Goodbye, Polly. He watched her go with quivering lips as the little figure slowly faded into the shadow of the woods. He called in broken accents, Kiss Mama for me and tell her I wanted to go back and say goodbye, but Joe wouldn't let me. Yes, honey. And you, watch out for that old drunk man we saw once in the woods, Polly. Yes, don't let him get you. No, I won't. Goodbye. Goodbye. The last goodbye stuck in the boy's throat, but he lifted his blue eyes, saw his pony, and smiled through the tears. Part 2, The Wilderness. A journey of 1,000 miles through the unbroken wilderness, the home of the Choctaw and Chickasaw, Indian nations, and all on his own beautiful pony. It was no time for tears. The boy's soul leaped for joy. The party was a delightful one. Major Hines, a veteran of General Jackson's campaign, the commander of the famous Mississippi Dragoons at the Battle of New Orleans, was the leader, accompanied by his wife, her sister and niece, and best of all, a boy his own age, the Major's little son, Hal. Hal was also riding a pony. He was a nice enough pony, of course, as ponies went, but couldn't compare with his own. He made up his mind to race the first chance they got and show those pretty white heels to his rival. He was just dying to tell him how fast they could beat the ground, but he'd wait and surprise the party. A Negro maid accompanied the ladies, and a stalwart black man rode a pack mule laden with tents, blankets, and a cooking outfit. They stopped at houses when one could be reached at nightfall. If not, they camped in the woods beneath the towering trees. There was no need of tents unless it rained. So dense was the foliage that only here and there a bright star peeped through, or a moonbeam shot its silvery thread to the ground. The Indians were all friendly. It was the boast of the Choctaws that no man of their breed had ever shed the blood of a white man. For days they followed the course of the majestic river, rolling its yellow flood to the sea, and watched the lazy flat and keel boats drift slowly down to New Orleans, bearing the wealth of the new western world. The men who had manned these rude crafts were slowly tramping on foot back to their homes in the north. Their boats could not stem the tide for the return trip. Every day they passed these weary walkers. The boy was sorry they couldn't ride. His pony's step was so firm and quick and strong. He raced with Hal the first day and beat him so far there was no fun in it. He never challenged his rival again. He was the guest of Major Hines on this trip. It would be rude, but he slipped out in the dark that night and hugged his pony. You're the finest horse that ever was, he whispered. Of course I am, the pony laughed. I love you. And I love you, was the quick response as the warm nose touched his cheek. In the second week, they reached the first stand, Folsom's, on the border of the Choctaw Nation. These stands were log cabins occupied by squaw men, whites who had married Indian women. They must pass 3 more of these stands, the major said. The LaFleurs, known as the first and second French camps, and the one at the crossing of the Tennessee River, which had the unusual distinction of being kept by a half-breed Chickasaw Indian. Here, weary, footsore travelers stopped to rest and refresh themselves, and many drooped and died miles from those they loved. The little graveyard with its rude, wooden-marked mounds the boy saw with a dull ache in his heart, and then the first bitter pang of homesickness came. He wondered if his sweet mother were well. He wondered what she had said when they told her he had gone. He knew she had cried. What if she were dead and he could not see her again? He sat down on the log, buried his face in his hands, and tried to cry the ache out of his heart. He felt that he must turn back or die, but it wouldn't do. He had promised his big brother. He rose, brushed the tears away, fed and watered his pony, and tenderly rubbed down every inch of its beautiful black skin. He forgot the ache in his newfound love and the strength which had come into the boy's soul from the sense of kinship with nature, which this beautiful, dumb, 4-footed friend had brought him. No man could be friendless or forsaken who possessed the love of a horse. His horse knew and loved him. He said it in 100 ways. His wide, deep, lustrous eyes, shining with intelligence, had told him. So had the touch of his big, warm mouth and many a friendly pony kiss. A pony could laugh, too. He had seen the smile flicker about his mouth and eyes as he pretended to bite his bare legs. How could any human being be cruel or mean to a horse? His pony had given him new courage and conscious power. He was the master of nature now. When they flew along the trail through the deep woods, his horse had given him wings. He looked up to the star-sown sky and promised God to be kind and gentle to all the dumb world for the love of the beautiful friend he had given. Part 3. The Hermitage. At the last stand on the banks of the winding Tennessee, the Major sat up late in eager discussion about Old Hickory with an enthusiastic Tennessean. The ladies had retired, and the boy listened with quiet eagerness to the talk. "Well, we're going to make Andrew Jackson president anyhow, Major," the Tennessean drawled. "I'm afraid they'll beat us," the Major answered with a shake of his head. "How they beat us when we get ready to make the fight? Old Hickory says himself he ain't fit." "I reckon we know more about that than he does," persisted the man from Tennessee. "The aristocrats don't think so." "What the hell they got to do agin him? Ain't he the biggest man in this country today? Didn't he lick Spain and England both at Pensacola? And didn't he finish the Redcoats at New Orleans?" "They say his education's poor." "He knowed enough to make his country cock of the walk. What more they want? Damn 'em." "They say he swears," the Tennessean roared. "Well, if all the cussin' men vote for him, he'll sure be elected. The real trouble," the Major said thoughtfully, "is what the scandal markers keep saying about his wife. He's killed one son of a gun about that already, and they better let him alone." "That's just it, my friend. He killed a skunk in a duel, and it's not the only one he has fought either. Old Hickory's got the temper of a devil. Well, there ain't nothing in them lies about his wife." The Major lifted his hand and moved closer. "There's just enough truth at the bottom of it, all to give the liars a chance they need to talk forever." "I never knowed there was any grain of truth in it at all." "There is, though," the Major interrupted. "And that's where we're going to have a big fight on our hands when it comes to the rub. This Lewis Robards, her first husband, was a quarrelsome cuss. Every man that looked at his wife he swore was after her. And if she lifted her eyes, he was sure she was guilty. There was no divorce law in Virginia, and Robards petitioned the legislature to pass an act of divorce in his favor. The dog swore in this petition that his wife had deserted him and was living with Andrew Jackson. He was boarding with her mother, the widow Donaldson. The legislature had passed the act, but had only authorized the courts of the territory of Kentucky to try the case and grant the divorce if the facts were proven. Robards never went to court with it for over 2 years, and Jackson, under the impression that the legislature had given the divorce, married Rachel Robards at Natchez in August of 1791. 2 years later, the skunk slips into court and gets his divorce. As quick as Old Hickory heard this, he married her over again. There was a mighty hullabaloo kicked up about it by the politicians. They tried to run Jackson out of the country, the little pups who were afraid of him. He challenged the leader of this pack of hounds and shot him dead. "Serves him right, too," broke in the Tennessean, removing his pipe with a nod of his shaggy head. "But it don't help him on the way to Washington," the Major grunted, suddenly rising and dismissing the subject for the night. The boy's curiosity was kindled to see the great man whose name had filled the void. The distance to Nashville was quickly covered. The Major pressed straight through the town without pause and drew rein at the general's gate. The welcome they received from their distinguished host was so simple, so genuine, so real, the boy's heart went out in loyal admiration. The house was a big, rambling structure of logs, in front of which stood a stately grove of magnificent forest trees. Behind it stretched the grain and cotton fields. Nothing could surpass the unaffected and perfect courtesy with which the general welcomed his guests. The tall, stately figure, moving with the unconscious grace of perfect manhood, needed no rules of a dancing master for his guidance. He had sprung from the common people, but he was a born leader and a ruler of men. The boy listened with keen ears to hear him rip out one of those terrible oaths of which so much had been said. His speech was gentle and kind. and he asked a blessing at every meal, and exactly as his own quiet, dignified father at home. In all the 3 weeks they remained his guests, not an oath or an ugly word fell from his lips. The boy wondered how people could tell such lies. The general liked boys. It was easy to see that. He gave hours of his time to the games and sports of his adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr., and his 2 little guests. He got up contests of all sorts. They raced their ponies, they ran and jumped, they played marbles, they followed the hounds, and always with them as friend and counselor, the general. Gentle, kind, considerate. The only thing he prohibited was wrestling. "No, boys," he said with a frown, "it's not a good sport for high-spirited youth. To feel the hand of a rival on your body may lead to a fight." The deep-set eyes flashed with the memory of his own hot-blooded boyhood and young manhood. The general's wife won the boy's heart from the moment he saw her. How they could tell such lies, he kept repeating with boyish indignation. Pure and sweet as the face of his own mother was hers, loving, unselfish, tender, and thoughtful, she moved through the house with the gentle step of a ministering angel. The knightly deference with which the general attended her slightest wish stirred the boy's imagination. He could see him standing erect, pistol in hand, in the gray dawn of the morning on which he faced the enemy who had slandered her. He could see the big firm hand grip the pistol's handle in a clasp of steel as he waited the signal of death. He wondered what sort of wound Dickinson's bullet had made in the general's breast. Anyhow, it had not been fatal. His enemy lived but a few hours. He set his lips firmly and repeated the Tennessean's verdict. Served him right, too. The boy left the hermitage under the spell of Old Hickory's personality for life. He had seen a great man. Part 4. The Monastery's Bells. The journey from Nashville to Springfield, Kentucky was quick and uneventful. Long before, the spire of St. Thomas's Church loomed on the horizon. They passed through the wide, fertile fields of the Dominican monks. The grim figure of a black friar was directing the harvest of a sea of golden yellow wheat. His workmen were sleek Negro slaves. Herds of fat cattle grazed on the hills. A flock of 1,000 sheep were nipping the fresh, sweet grass in the valley. They paused past a big flour mill whose lazy wheels swung in rhythmic unison with the laughing waters of the creek that watered the rich valley. The monks were vowed to poverty and self-denial, but their order was rich in slaves and land, and mills and herds, and flocks and generous harvests. As the sun sank in a smother of purple and red behind the hills, they saw the church and monastery. The bells were chanting their call to evening prayer. The boy held his breath in silent ecstasy. He had never heard anything like it before. It was wonderful, those sweet notes echoing over hill and valley in the solemn hush of the gathering twilight. They waited for the priests to emerge from the chapel before making their presence known. Through the open windows, the deep, solemn throb of the organ pealed. The soul of the boy rose enchanted on new wings whose power he had never dreamed. Hidden depths were sounded, of whose existence he could not know. There was no organ in the little bare log church the Baptists had built near his father's farm in Mississippi. His father and mother were Baptists, and of course he was going to be a Baptist someday. But why didn't they have stained glass windows like those through which he saw the light now streaming, wonderful flashing lights, whose color seemed to pour from the soul of the organ? And why didn't they have a great organ? He was going to like these Roman Catholics. He wondered what his mother would say to that. It all seemed so familiar. Where had he heard those bells? Where had he heard the peal of that organ and seen the flash of those gorgeous lights? In the sky at sunset, perhaps, and in the rumble of the storm, maybe in his dreams. And now they had come true. In a few months, he found himself the only Protestant boy in school and the smallest of all of the scholars. The monks were kind. They seemed to somehow to love him better than the others. Father Wallace reminded him of his big brother. He was so gentle. The boy made up his mind to join the Catholic Church and went straight to Father Wilson, the venerable head of the college. The old man smiled pleasantly. And why do you wish to do this, my son? Oh, It's so much more beautiful than the Baptist church. Besides, it's so much easier. Indeed? Yes, sir. The Baptists have such a hard time getting religion. They seek and mourn so long. Really? Indeed they do. Yes, sir. I've seen stubborn sinners mourn all summer in 3 protracted meetings, and then not come through. And you don't like that sort of penance? No, sir. I've always dreaded it. And the worst thing is, the new converts have to stand right up in church before all the crowd and tell their experience out loud. I'd hate that. And you like our ways better? A great deal better. The Catholics manage things so nicely. All you have to do is go to church, learn the catechism, and the good priests do all the rest. Oh, I see. Yes, sir. Father Wilson laid his wrinkled hand tenderly on the boy's head. You are very, very young, my son, and you are growing rapidly. What you really need is good Catholic food. Sit down and have a piece of bread and cheese with me. The boy sat down and ate the offered bread and cheese in silence. I can't join, Father Wilson? He asked at last. The priest smiled again. No, my son. You don't like me, Father? The boy asked wistfully. We like you very much, sir, but we are responsible for the trust your father and mother have put in us. In God's own time, when you are older and know the full meaning of your act, I should be glad, but not this way. The boy was small, a fact that a fine old priest, in pity for his tender years, had a little bed put in his own room to watch the light and shadows in the eager young eyes when homesickness threatened. And then he talked of the wonders and glory of Rome on her 7 hills by the Tiber, of the Colosseum, the death of Christian martyrs in the arena, of the splendor of St. Peter's, besides whose glory all other churches pale into insignificance. He lifted the curtain of history, gave the child's mind flashes of the old world, whose pageants stretched down the ages into the mists of eternity. Of books the boy learned little, but the monks kindled a light in his soul, and the years could not dim. To the other students the old man was not so gentle. They were tougher, and he set their tasks accordingly. They had rebelled at last and decided on revenge. The plot was hatched and in all readiness for its execution. The only problem was how to put the light out in his room. The boy held the key to the citadel. He was on the inside. He could blow the candle out, and the thing was done. He refused at first, but the rebels crowded around him and appealed to his sense of loyalty. They could force you to sleep in his room, pleaded the ringleader, but by Jiminy, that don't make you a monk, does it? No, of course not. You're one of us. Stand by us. You didn't ask to sleep in his old room, did you? No. Well, you're there. The right man in the right place at the nick of time. Will you stand by us? What do you want me to do? Just blow out the candle, that's all. We'll do the rest. Will you do it? The boy hesitated, smiled, and said, Yes, when everything's quiet. The old man had gone to bed and began to snore. The boy rose noiselessly and blew the candle out. Instantly, from the darkness without, poured a volley of cabbage heads, squashes, potatoes, and biscuits. Not a word was spoken, but the charge of the light brigade was swift and terrible. The boy pulled the cover over his head and waited for the storm to pass. When the light was lit and a search made, not a culprit could be found. They were all in bed, sound asleep. The only one awake was the boy, in the little bed on which lay scattered potatoes, biscuits, and cabbage. The priest drew him from under the cover. His face was stern, the firm mouth rigid with anger. Did you know they were going to do that, sir? He asked. The boy trembled but held his tongue. Answer me, sir. I didn't know just what they were going to do. You knew they were up to something? Yes. And you didn't tell me? No. Why? Couldn't be a traitor, sir. To these young rascals, no, but you could betray me. I'm not a monk, Father. Tell me what you know at once, sir, before I thrash you. I don't know much, the boy slowly answered, and I can't tell you that. There was a final ring in the tones with which he ended the sentence. The culprit must be punished. It was out of the question that he should whip him. This quiet, gentle, bright little fellow he had grown to love. He was turned over to another, an old monk of fine face, and voice full of persuasive music. He took the boy by the hand and led him up to the last flight of stairs to the top of the house and into a tiny bare room. The only piece of furniture was an ominous-looking cot in the middle of the floor. The boy had not read the history of the Spanish Inquisition, but it required no great learning in history or philosophy to guess the use of that machine. There was no terror in the blue eyes. Their light grew hard with resolution. The monk to whom he had been delivered for punishment was one of all the monastery who had the kindest, gentlest face. The boy had always thought him one of his best friends, yet without word he laid the culprit face downward on the strange leather couch and drew the straps around his slim body. He had dreamed of mercy, but all hope vanished now. He held his breath and set his lips to receive the blow, the first he had ever felt. The monk took the switch in his hand and hesitated. He loved the bright, handsome lad. The task was harder than he thought. He knelt beside the cot and put his hand on the dark little head. "I hate to strike you, my son." "Don't then, father," was the eager answer. "I've always had a very tender spot in my heart for you. Tell me what you know, and it'll be all right." "I can't, no matter how little, and I'll let you off. Will you?" "I promise." "I know one thing," the boy said with a smile. "Yes, I know who blew out the light." "Good. If you tell that much, you'll let me off?" "Yes, my son." The little head wagged doubtfully. "Honest, father, I give you my solemn word. I blew it out." The fine old face twitched with suppressed laughter as he loosed the straps, sat down on the cot, and drew the youngster in his lap. "You're a bright chap, my son. You'll go far in this world some day. A great diplomat, perhaps, but the road you've started on tonight can only lead you at last to a blind alley. You know now that I love you, don't you?" "Yes, father. Come down, my boy. There's too much strength and character in those fine eyes, that splendid square chin and jaw, for you to let roistering fools lead you by the nose. You wouldn't have gotten into that devilment if they hadn't persuaded you, now would you? No. All right? Use the brain and heart God has given you. Don't let fools use it for their own ends. Do your own thinking. Be your own man. Stand on your own bottom." And then in low tones, the fine old face glowing with enthusiasm, the monk talked to his little friend of truth and right, of character and principle, of love and God, until the tears began to slowly steal down the rosy cheeks. A new resolution fixed itself in the boy's soul. He would live his own life. No other human being should do it for him. Part 5. Home. The mother's heart rebelled at last. She would not be put off longer. Her baby had been gone 2 years. She refused point blank to listen to any further argument. Charles Green, the young Mississippian, studying law in Kentucky and acting as the boy's guardian, was notified to bring him at the end of the spring term. On a glorious day in July, they left Bardstown for Louisville to take the new steamboat line for home. These wonderful boats were the marvels of their day. Their names conveyed but a hint of the awe they inspired. The fleet of 3 vessels bore the titles Volcano, Vesuvius, and Etna, and the sparks that flew heavenward from their black chimneys were far more impressive to the people who crowded the shores than the smoke and lava of old Vesuvius to the lazy loungers of Naples. The boy saw his pony safely housed on board the Etna, and amid the clang of bells and screams of whistles, the floating wonder swung out from her wharf into the yellow tide of the Ohio. Scores of people crowded her decks for the pleasure of a ride 10 miles down the river to return in their carriages. The captain of the Etna, Robinson DeHart, held the boy in a spell of his lofty manners. He had been a sailor on board an ocean-going brig. To him, the landing of his vessel was an event no matter how often the stop was made, whether to put off a single passenger or take on a regiment. In fact, he never landed the Etna even to take on a cord of wood without the use of his enormous speaking trumpet and his big brass spyglass. A beautiful, slow, uneventful voyage on the Father of the Waters landed the boy in safety at the Woodville stopping place. He leaped down the gangplank with a shout and clasped his big brother's hand. My, but how you've grown, boy. Haven't I? Won't little mother be surprised and glad?" "Let's fool her," the boy cried. "Let me go up by myself and she won't know me." "All right, we'll try." The boy stopped at the village, and the young stranger walked alone to his father's house. How beautiful it all seemed, the big log house with the cabins clustering around it. A horse neighed in the barn, and a colt answered from the field. He walked boldly up to the porch, and just inside the door sat his lovely mother. She had been one of the most beautiful girls in all of South Carolina in her day, his father had often said. She was beautiful still. She had known what happiness was. She was the mother of 10 strong children, 5 boys and 5 girls, and her heart was young with their joys and hopes. A smile was playing about her fine mouth. She was dreaming, perhaps, of his coming. The boy cleared his throat with a deep, manly note and spoke in studied, careless tones. "See any stray horses around here, ma'am?" The mother's eyes flashed as she sprang through the doorway and snatched him to her heart with a cry of joy. "No, but I see a stray boy. Oh, my darling, my baby, my heart." And then words failed. She loosed her hold and held him at arm's length, tried to say something, but only clasped him again and cried for joy. "Please, Ma, let me have him," Polly pleaded. And then he clasped his sister in a long, voiceless hug, loosed her and caught her again. "I missed you, Polly, dear," he sighed. When all the others had been greeted, he turned to his mother. "Where's Pa?" "Down in the field with the colts." "I'll go find him." With a bound he was off. He wondered what his silent, undemonstrative father would do. He had always felt that he was a man of deep emotion for all his self-control. He saw him in the field, walked along the edge of the woods, and suddenly before him without warning. The father's lips trembled. He stood without a word, clasped the boy in his arms, and kissed him again and again. The youngster couldn't help wondering why a strong man should kiss so big a boy. The mother, yes, but his father, a man, no. It was sweet, this homecoming, to those who loved deepest. Somehow the monastery, its bells, its organ, its jeweled windows, and its kindly black-robed priest seemed far away and unreal now, only a dream that had passed. Part 6. Rebellion. The mother's breakdown was not allowed to stop the boy's education. Both father and older brother were determined on this. They would use the schools at home now. He was sent to the county academy in the fall. The boy didn't like it. After the easy life with the kindly old monks at St. Thomas, the academy was not only cheap, coarse, and uninteresting, but the teacher had no sense. He gave lessons so long and hard, it was impossible to memorize them. The boy complained to the teacher. A lesson of the same length was promptly given again. The rebel showed the teacher he was wrong by failing to know it. "I'll thrash you, sir," was the stern answer. The boy would not take that from such a fool. He rose in his wrath, went home, and poured out the indignant story of his wrongs. The father was a man of few words, but the long silence which followed gave a feeling of vague uneasiness. He was never dictatorial to his children, but meant what he said. His voice was quiet and persuasive when he finally spoke. "Of course, my son, you will have to choose for yourself whether you will work with your hands only or with your head and hands. You can't be an idler. I need more cotton pickers. You don't like school? Try the cotton. I'll give you work." The boy flushed and looked at his father keenly. It was no joke. He meant exactly what he said, and a boy with any sand in his gizzard couldn't back down. "All right, sir," was the firm answer. "I'll begin in the morning." He went forth to his task with grim determination. The sun of early September had just risen, and it was already hot as he bent to work. Cotton picking looked easy from a distance. When you got at it, things somehow were different. A task of everlasting monotony, this bending from bowl to bowl along the endless rows. He never realized before how long the cotton rows were. There was a little stop at the end before turning and selecting the next, but these rows seemed to stretch away into eternity. 3 hours at it, and he was mortally tired. His back ached and in dull, hopeless pain. He lifted his head and gazed longingly towards the school he had scorned. "What a fool," he sighed, "but I'll stick to it. I can do what any nigger can." He looked curiously at the slaves who worked without apparent effort. Not one of them seemed the least bit tired. He could get used to it after all. This breath of the open world was better than being cooped up in a stuffy old schoolhouse with a fool to set impossible tasks. "Pooh! I'll show my father," he exclaimed. The Negroes broke into a plantation song. Jim Pemberton, the leader, sang each stanza in a clear, fine tenor that rang over the fields and echoed through the deep woods. The others joined in the chorus, and after the last verse repeated in low, sweet notes that died away so softly it was impossible to tell the moment the song had ceased. The music was beautiful, but it was impossible for him to join in their singing. He couldn't lower himself to an equality with black slaves. This cotton picking seemed part of their scheme of life. Their strong black bodies swayed in a sort of rhythmic motion, even when they were not singing. Somehow his body didn't fit into the scheme. His back ached and ached. No matter. He had chosen, and he would show them he had the man's spirit inside a boy's breast. At noon the ache had worn away, and he felt a sense of joy in conquering the pain. He ate his dinner in silence and wondered what Polly was thinking about at school. Girl-like, she had cried and begged him to go back, with a cheerful wave of his hand to his mother. He returned to the field before the Negroes, strapped the bag on his shoulder, and bent again to his task. The afternoon was long. It seemed at 3 o'clock there could be no end to it. And still those long, long rows of white fleece stretched on and on into eternity, all alike in dull, tiresome monotony. He whistled to keep up his courage. The Negroes whispered to one another and smiled as they looked his way. He paid no attention. By 4 o'clock the weariness had become a habit, and at sundown he felt stronger than at dawn. He swung the bag over his back and started to the weighing place. "Pooh, it's easy," he said with a scorn. The Negroes crowded around his pile of cotton. "Dat boy's sho' one cotton picker," cried Jim Pemberton, regarding him with grinning admiration. "Of course I can pick cotton if I wanted to." "But you really don't want her," Jim grinned. "Sure I do. I'm sick of school." Jim laughed aloud and, coming close, whispered insinuatingly, "I sho' sick of picking cotton, and when you quits the job, I'm not going to quit." "Yassa, I understand that. But the point is, when you do quit, don't forget Jim, Master Jeff. I likes you. You's got the spunk. I wants to be yo' man." The appeal touched the boy's pride. He answered with a quiet dignity, "All right, James." Jim lifted his head and walled his eyes. "Des listen at him call me James. I know a real master when I sees him." That night the father asked no questions and made no comments on the fact that he had picked 110 pounds of cotton, as much as any man in the fields. His deciding to work with his hands had apparently been accepted as final. This thing of deciding life for himself was a serious business. It would be very silly to jump into a career with slaves, coarse and degrading, just because a fool happened to be teaching at the county academy. He must have think this thing over. Tired as he was, he laid awake until 11 o'clock, thinking for himself. It was lonesome work, too, this thinking for himself. If his father had only done the thinking for him, it would have been so much easier to accept his decision and then rebel if he didn't like it. He returned to the field next morning with renewed determination. Through the long, hot, interminable day, he bent and fought the battle in silence. His back ached worse than the first day. Every muscle in his finely strung little body was bruised and sore and on fire. He began to ask if his father were right. Wasn't a man a double fool who had brains and refused to use them? An idiot could pick cotton when the bag was fastened on his back. All he needed was one hand. All he had to do was bend, hour after hour, day after day, until it became the habit of life and the ache stopped. He could see this now for himself. He smiled at the quiet wisdom of his father. He certainly knew how to manage boys. He must acknowledge that. He was quiet and considerate about it, too. He didn't dictate. He only suggested things for consideration and choice. It was easy to meet the views of that kind of a father. He treated a boy with the dignity of a man. When the cotton was weighed, the boy faced his father. "I've thought it all over, sir, and I'd like to go back to school." "All right, my son, you can return in the morning." He made no comment. He indulged in no smile at the boy's expense. He received his decision with the serious dignity of a judge of the Supreme Court of Life. The rebellion ended for all time. Teachers and schools took on a new meaning. A lesson was no longer a hard task set by a heartless fool who had been accidentally placed in a position of power. School meant the training of his mind for a higher and more useful life. Progress now was steady. The next year, a new teacher came, a real teacher, the Reverend John Shaw from Boston, Massachusetts, a man of even temper, just, gentle, a profound scholar with a mind whose contagious enthusiasm drew the spirits of the young as a magnet. The boy learned more under his guidance within a year than in all his life before, and the following fall was ready to enter Transylvania University at Lexington, Kentucky. The polite, handsome boy from Mississippi, who had served an apprenticeship with his father's Negroes in a cotton field, gave the professors no trouble. Good-natured, prudent, joyous, kind, manly, he attended to his lessons and his own business. He neither gambled nor drank nor mingled with the rowdy set. He had come there for something else. He had just passed his examination for the senior class in July of 1824, when the first great sorrow came. The wise father, whom he had grown to love and reverence, died in his 68th year. His thoughtful big brother came in person to tell him and break the blow with the new ambitions and new hopes. He had secured an appointment from President Monroe as a cadet to West Point from the state of Mississippi. And then began the 4 years of stern discipline that makes a soldier and fits him to command men. But once in those busy years did the gay spirit within rise in rebellion to learn wisdom in the bitterness of experience. With Emile Lasserie, his jolly Creole friend from Louisiana, he slipped down to Benny Havens on a frolic, taking French leave, of course. The alarm was given of the approach of an instructor, and the two culprits bolted for the barracks at breakneck speed through pitch darkness. Scrambling madly through the woods, there was a sudden cry, crash, and silence. He had fallen 60 feet over a precipice to the banks of the Hudson. Young Lasserie crawled carefully to the edge of the rock, peered over, and called through the darkness, "Are you dead, Jeff?" He was suffering, too, much to laugh, though he determined to give it an Irishman's reply to that question if it killed him. He managed to wheeze back the answer, "Not dead, but spatchless." Many were the temptations of rebellion from the friends he loved in the years that followed, but never again did he yield. Somehow the thing didn't work in his case. There was one professor who put his decision of obedience to the supreme test. For some reason, this particular instructor took a violent dislike to the tall, dignified young Southerner. Perhaps because he was more anxious to have the love of his cadet friends than the approval of his teachers. Perhaps from some hidden spring of character within the teacher, which antagonized the firm will and strong personality of the student, who dared to do his own thinking. From whatever cause, it was plain to all that the professor sought opportunities to insult and browbeat the cadet he could not provoke into open rebellion. The professor was lecturing the class on presence of mind as the supreme requisite of a successful soldier. He paused and looked directly at his young enemy. Of course, there are some who will always be confused and wanting in an emergency, not from cowardice, but from the mediocre nature of their minds. The insult was direct and intended. He hoped to provoke an outburst which would bring punishment if not disgrace. The cadet's lips merely tightened, and the steel from the depths of his blue eyes flashed into his enemy's for a moment. He would bide his time. 3 days later, in a building crowded with students, the professor was teaching the class the process of making fireballs. The room was a storehouse of explosives, and the ball suddenly burst into flames. Cadet Davis saw it first and calmly turned to his tormentor. "The fireball is ignited, sir. What shall I do?" The professor dashed for the door. "Run! Run for your lives!" The cadet snatched the fireball from the floor, dashed it through the window, and calmly walked out. He had saved many lives in the building from destruction. His revenge was complete and sweet, but deeper and sweeter than his triumph over an enemy was the consciousness that he was master of himself. He had learned life's profoundest lesson. Part 7. Life. On his graduation, the second lieutenant of infantry from the state of Mississippi, barely 20 years old, reported for duty to the Jefferson barracks at St. Louis. He was ordered to the frontier to extend the boundaries of the growing republic, now accompanied by his faithful body servant, James Pemberton. The fort, situated on the Wisconsin River, was the northern limit of the Illinois tribe of Indians and the starting point of all the raids against the Iroquois, who still held the rich lands around the village of Chicago. The boy lieutenant was the first lumberman to put axe into the virgin forests of Wisconsin. He was sent into the wilderness with a detachment for cutting timber to enlarge the fort. Under the direction of 2 voyagers, he embarked in a little open boat and began the perilous journey. The first day out, his courage and presence of mind were put to the test. The Indians suddenly appeared on the shore and demanded a trade for tobacco. The little party rowed to the banks and began to parley. A guide's keen eyes saw through their smooth palaver the hostile purpose of a bloody surprise and warned the commander. The order to push into the river and pull for their lives was instantly given. With savage yells, the Indians sprang to their canoes and gave chase. It was 10-1, and they were sure of their prey. The chance of escape from such strong, swift rowers in light bark canoes was slight. The low, fierce cries of victory and the joyous shout of coming torture rang over the waters. The Indians gained rapidly. The young lieutenant's cry measured the distance between them and saw the race was hopeless. With quick command, he ordered a huge blanket stretched in the bow for a sail. The wind was blowing a furious gale and might swamp their tiny craft. It was drowning or death by torture. The commander's choice was instantaneous. The frail boat plunged suddenly forward, swayed and surged from side to side through the angry, swirling waters, settled at last, and drew steadily away from the maddened savages. With a curious smile, the boyish commander stood in the stern and watched the black swarm of yelling devils fade into the distance. He was thinking of his old professor at West Point. His insult had been the one thing in life which he owed most. He could see that clearly now. His heart went out in a wave of gratitude to his enemy. Our enemies are always our best friends when we have eyes to see. The winter following, he was ordered down to Winnebago. The village of Chicago was the nearest center of civilization. The only way of reaching it was by wagon, and the journey consumed 3 months. There was much gambling in the long, still nights and some drinking. In lieu of excitement of the gaming table, he took his fun in breaking and riding wild horses, and hairbreadth escapes were the order of his daily exercise. It was gambling, perhaps, but it developed the muscles of his mind and body. His success with horses was remarkable. No animal that man has broken to his use is keener to recognize a master and flout a coward than a horse. No coward has ever been able to do anything with a spirited horse. He was wrestling one day with a particular vicious specimen, to the terror and anguish of Jim Pemberton. "For the Lord's sake, Marse Jeff, let that devil go." "No, James, not yet." "He ain't no count nohow." "All the more reason why I should be his master, not he be mine." The horse was possessed of 7 devils. He jumped and plunged and bucked, wheeled and reared, and walked on his hind legs in mad effort to throw the cool rider. The moment he reared, the lieutenant dropped his feet from the stirrups and leaned close to the brute's trembling, angry head. At last, in one supreme effort, the beast threw himself straight into the air and fell backwards with the savage purpose of crushing his tormentor beneath his body. With a quiet laugh, the young officer slipped from the saddle and allowed him to thump himself in a crashing blow. As the horse sprang to his feet to run, the lieutenant leaped lightly into the saddle, and the fight was over. "Well, for the Lord, did you ever see the beat of that?" Jim Pemberton cried with laughing admiration. Scarcely a week passed without its dangerous excursions against the Pawnee. Comanches, and other hostile tribes of Indians. The friendly tribes, too, were everlastingly changing to hostiles in a night. Death rode in the saddle with every man who left a fortified post. In these early days of our national life, the lieutenant was ordered on a peculiarly long and daring raid into hostile territory and twice barely escaped a massacre. Their errand accomplished, and leisurely returning to the fort, they suddenly met a large party of Indians. The lieutenant shot a swift glance at their leader and saluted him with friendly, uplifted hand. "Can you tell us the way to the fort, Chief?" The tall brave placed himself squarely in the path and pointed in the wrong direction. Instantly the lieutenant spurred his horse squarely on the savage, grasped him by the hair, dragged him 100 yards, and flung him into the bushes. The assault was so sudden, so unexpected, so daring, the whole band was completely cowed, and the soldiers rode by without attack. Nor was the Indian the only enemy to test the youngster's mettle. The pioneer soldiers of the rank and file in these turbulent days had minds of their own which they sometimes dared to use. The lieutenant had no beard. His smooth, handsome face, clear blue eyes, fresh color, and gay laughter gave the impression of a boy of 19 when by the calendar he could boast of 21. A big, strapping, bearded soldier employed in building the fort had proven himself the terror of his fellow workmen. He was a man of enormous strength and gave full rein to an ugly, quarrelsome disposition. His eyes rested with decided disapproval on the graceful young master of horses. "I'll whip that baby-faced lieutenant," he coolly announced to his satellites, "if he ever opens his jaws to me. Watch me if I don't. What does he know about work?" The men reported the threat to the lieutenant. The next day, without a moment's hesitation, in quiet tones, he gave his first order to the giant. "Put that piece of dressed scantling beside the window." The man deliberately lifted a rough board and placed it. "The rough board won't do," said the even voice. "It must be a dressed scantling." The soldier threw him an insolent laugh and stooped to take up a board exactly like the one he had laid down. The baby-faced lieutenant suddenly seized a club, knocked him down, and beat him until he yelled for quarter. The soldiers had watched the clash at first with grins and winks and nudges, betting on their giant. His strength was invincible. When the unexpected happened and they saw the slender, plucky youngster standing over the form of the fallen brave, they raised a lusty shot for him. When the giant scrambled to his feet, the victor said with a smile, "This has been a fight, man to man, and I'm satisfied. I'll not report it officially." The big one grinned sheepishly and respectfully offered his hand. "You're all right, Lieutenant. I made a mistake. I beg your pardon. You're the kind of commander I always liked." Again the soldiers gave a shout. No man under him ever again presumed on his beardless face. He had only to make his orders known to have them instantly obeyed. Jim Pemberton had watched the little drama of officer and man with an ugly light gleaming in his eyes. The young master had not seen him. That night, in his quarters, Jim quietly said, "I'd have killed him if he lay his big claws on you, Master Jeff. Would you, James?" "Dat I would, sir." Nothing more was said, but a new bond was sealed between master and man. While at Fort Crawford, the lieutenant had been ordered up the Yellow River to build a sawmill. He had handled the neighborly Indians with such friendly skill and won their goodwill so completely, he was adopted by their chief as a brother of the tribe. An old Indian woman, bent with age, traveled 100 miles to the fort to warn the little chief of a coming attack of hostile bands. Her warning was unheeded by the new commander, and a massacre followed. The success of this attack raised the war spirit of the entire frontier and gave the soldiers a winter of exceptional danger and hardship. The country in every direction swarmed with red warriors on the warpath. The weather was intensely cold, and his southern blood suffered agonies unknown to his companions. Often wet to the skin and compelled to remain in the saddle, the exposure at last brought on pneumonia. For months he lay in his bed, directing as best he could the work of his men. James Pemberton lifted his weak, emaciated form in his arms as if he were a child. The black man carried his money, his sword, and pistols. At any moment, day or night, he could have stepped from the door into the wilderness and been free. He was free. He loved the man he served. With tireless patience and tenderness, he nursed him back from the shadows of death into life again. On recovering from this illness, the lieutenant faced a new commander at the head of his regiment, a man destined to set in motion the greatest event of his life. Colonel Zachary Taylor had been promoted to the command of the 1st Infantry on the death of Colonel Morgan. Already he had earned the title that would become the slogan of his followers in the campaign which made him president. Old Rough and Ready at this time was in the prime of his vigorous manhood. Colonel Taylor sent the lieutenant on an ugly, important mission. 400 pioneers had taken possession of the lead mines at Dubuque against the protests of the Indians whose rights had been ignored. The lieutenant and 50 men were commissioned to eject the miners. To a man, they were heavily armed. They believed they were being cheated of their right of discovery by the red tape of government interference. They had sworn to resist any effort to drive them out of these mines. Most of them were men of the higher type of Western adventurers. The lieutenant liked these hardy sons of his own race and determined not to use force against them if it could be avoided. He crossed the river to announce his official instructions, and it was met by a squad of daring, resolute fellows armed and ready to fight. Their leader, a tall, red-headed, serious-looking man, opened the conference with scant ceremony. Looking on the youthful officer squarely in the eye, he slowly drawled, "Young man, we have defied the government once before, when they sent their boys up here to steal our mines. Now, if you know when you're well off, you'll let honest white men alone and quit siding with the Indians." There was no mistaking his accent. He meant war. The lieutenant's answer came in quick, even tones. "The United States government has ordered your removal, gentlemen. My business as a soldier is to obey. I shall be sorry to use force, but I'll do it if it's necessary. I suggest a private interview with your leader." He nodded to the red-headed man. "Sure. Talk it over. All right." The men from all sides gave their approval. The leader hesitated a moment and measured the tall, straight young officer. He didn't like this wrestle at close quarters with those penetrating eyes and the trained mind behind them, but with a toss of his red locks he muttered, "All right, fire away. You can talk your head off for all the good it'll do you." They walked together a few yards and sat down. With the friendliest smile, the lieutenant extended his hand. "Before we begin our chat, let's shake hands." "Certain, sure." The brawny hand clasped his. "I want you to know," the young officer continued earnestly, "my real feelings towards you and your men. I've been out here 4 years with your fellows, pushing the flag into the wilderness, and the more I see of you, the better I like you. I know real men when I see them. You're strong, generous, brave, and do things. You're building a great republic on the frontier of this world. I've known your hospitality. You've had little education in the schools, but you've trained for this big work in the only school that counts out here, the school of danger and struggle and experience." The brawny hand was lifted in a helpless sort of protest. "Looky here, boy. You're going to bamboozle me. I can just feel it in my bones. On the other hand," the lieutenant continued eagerly, "I assure you that I'm going to treat you and your friends with the profoundest respect. It's due you. Let's reason this thing out. You've taken up these mines under the old rights of our first discovery." "Yes, and ours, too." The lean jaws came together with a snap. "So I say. But it will take a little time and a little patience to establish your rights. The Indians, you know, hold the first rights to this land. Hell with the Indians. Even so, isn't it better to first settle their claims and avoid war? Maybe so. And you know we can't settle with the Indians while you hold by force the mines they claim as the owners of the soil." The leader scratched his head and rose with sudden resolutions. "Come on and tell this to the boys." The leader escorted the lieutenant to the crowd and commanded them to hear him. His speech was interrupted at first by angry exclamations, but At its close there was respectful silence. The fight was won without a blow. The new colonel was much pleased at the successful ending of the dangerous job. He had received the orders to eject these miners with a wry face. That the work had been done without bloodshed had lifted a load from his head. The lieutenant was honored on the night of his return by an invitation to dine with Colonel Taylor's family. They had been settled in the crowded quarters of the fort during his absence, the wife, 3 daughters, and a little son. The lieutenant's curiosity was but mildly roused at the thought of meeting the girls. In the lofty ways of youth he had put marriage out of his mind. A soldier should not marry. He had given his whole soul to his country, its flag, and its service. He would be agreeable to the ladies, of course, in deference to his commander, and the honor he was receiving at his hands. The dinner was a success. The mother was charming and gracious in her welcome. Something in her ways recalled his own mother. She extended her hand with a genial smile and took his breath with her first remark. "I've quite fallen in love with you, sir, because of a story I heard of your West Point career." "Not in pity for my fall over the cliff, I hope," he answered gravely. The mother's voice dropped to a whisper. "No, your friend Albert Sidney Johnston told me that you saved a large part of your allowance and sent it home to your young mother." The young officer's lips trembled and he looked away for a moment. "But she sent it back to me, madam." "Yes, until you wrote that she hurt you by not keeping it." To relieve his evident embarrassment, the mother introduced him in rapid successions to her daughters. The eldest Anne, the second Sarah Knox, the youngest Elizabeth. Richard, the handsome little boy, had introduced himself. He had liked the lieutenant from first. He had been so surprised by the mother's possession of one of the sweetest secrets of his schoolboy life, and had blushed so furiously over it he had scarcely noticed the girls, merely bowing in his confusion. It was not until they were seated at the table and the dinner had fairly begun that he became conscious of the charm of the second daughter, who sat directly opposite. Her beauty was not dazzling, but in 15 minutes she had completely absorbed his attention. It was impossible, of course, not to look at her. She sat squarely before him. There was no embarrassment in the frank, honest curiosity with which she returned his gaze. The thing that first impressed him was the frankness of a winsome personality. He listened with keen attention to her voice. There was no simper, no affection, no posing. She was just herself. He found himself analyzing her character. Refined, yes, intelligent beyond a doubt. She talked with her father in a quiet, authoritative way, which left no doubt on that score. Graceful, tender, sincere, too. Her tones to her impulsive brother and her younger sister proved that. And a will of her own she had. The firmly set full lips were eloquent of character. He liked that above all things in a woman. He couldn't stand a simpering doll. "Sing for us, Sarah," her brother said impulsively as they rose from the table. "Certainly, Dick, if you wish it." There was no holding back for the urging, no mock modesty, no foolishness in her answer. It was straight, affectionate, responsive, open-hearted, generous, just like his own sweet little sister Polly when he'd asked her a favor, and then he blushed to find himself staring in a sort of dreamy reverie. He hoped her music would not spoil the impression her personality had made. This had happened once in his life. He could never talk to the girl again after he had heard her sing. The memory of it was a nightmare. He watched her tune the guitar with a sense of silly dread. The tuning finished, she turned to her brother and asked with a smile, "And what shall I sing, Sir Richard?" "The one I love best, Fairy Bells." When the first line with its sweet accompaniment floated out from the porch of the balmy air of the June evening, the lieutenant's fears had vanished. Never had he heard a song whose trembling melody so found his inmost soul. It set the fairy bells ringing in the deep woods of his faraway Mississippi home. He could see the fairy ringing them, her beautiful hair streaming in the moonlight, a smile on her lips, the joy and beauty of eternal youth in every movement of her exquisite form. When the last note had died softly away, he leaned close and before he knew what he was doing, whispered, "Glorious, Miss Sarah. You liked it very much? She asked. It's divine. My favorite, too. All night the fairy bells rang in his heart. For the first time in his life, he failed to sleep. He listened entranced until dawn. Part 8. Love. In the swift weeks which followed, life blossomed with new and wonderful meaning. In the stern years on the plains, the young officer had known but one motive of action, duty. He was an exile from home and its comforts, friends, and the haunts of civilized man for his country's sake. He had come to plant her flag on the farthest frontier and push it farther against all corners. In the struggle against the snows of winter and the pestilence of the summer wilderness, he had fought nature with the dogged determination of the soldier. Snow meant winter quarters, the spring marching and fighting. The hills were breastworks. The night brought dreams of strategy and surprise. The grass and flowers were symbols of a nation's wealth and the prophecy of war. By a strange magic, the coming of a girl had transformed the world. He had seen the strategic value of these hills and valleys often before. He had not dreamed of their beauty. The mists that hung over the ragged lines of the western horizon were no longer fog that might conceal an army. They were the folds of a huge veil which nature was softly drawing over the face of a beautiful bride. Why had he not seen this before? The awful silence of the plains from which he had fled to books had suddenly become God's great whispering gallery. He listened with joyous awe and reverence. The stars had been his guides by night to find the trail. He had merely lifted his eyes to make the reckoning. He had never seen before the crystal flash from their jeweled depths. He looked into the eyes of the graceful young rider by his side and longed to tell her of this miracle wrought in his soul, but he hesitated. She was too dignified and self-possessed. It would be silly when put into words, but the world today was too beautiful to hurry through it. He just couldn't. Let's stop on this hill and watch the sunset, Miss Sarah, he suggested. I'd love to, was the simple answer. With a light laugh, she sprang from the saddle. They touched the ground at the same moment. He looked at her with undisguised admiration. You're a wonderful rider, he said. A soldier's daughter must be as part of her life. He tied their horses to the low-hanging limbs of a cluster of scrub trees and found a seat on the boulders which the Indians had set for a landmark on the lowly hilltop. Westward the plains stretched, a silent ocean of green, luscious grass. What's that dark spot in the valley? The girl eagerly asked. Watch it a moment. They sat in silence for 5 minutes. Why, it's moving. Yes. How curious. An illusion? He suggested. Nonsense, I'm not dreaming. I've been dreaming a lot lately. A smile played around the corners of her fine mouth, but she ignored the hint. Tell me, she cried. You studied science at West Point? What does it mean? Look closely. Any 15-year-old boy of the plains could explain it. Am I so ignorant? She laughed. No, he answered soberly. Our eyes just refuse to see things at which we are looking until the voice within reveals. The eyes of a hunter could make no mistake about such a spot, particularly if it moved. It might be a passing cloud. There's none in the sky. Tell me, she pleaded. A herd of buffalo. That big black field? It must be 10 acres. The man laughed at her ignorance with a sudden longing in his heart to help and protect her. 10 acres? Look again. They are 20 miles away. The herd is packed so densely the ground is invisible. They cover 1,000 acres. Impossible. I assure you it's true. They were once even more plentiful, but we're pushing them back with the Indians into the sunset, and they too will fade away into the twilight at last. He stopped suddenly. He had almost spoken a sentence that would have committed him beyond retreat. It was just on his lips to say, I didn't take such tender views of Indians and buffaloes till I met you. For the life of him, he couldn't make the girl out. Her voice was music, her laughter contagious, and yet she was reserved. About her personality hung a spell which forbade familiarity. Flirting was a pastime in the army, but it had never appealed to him. He was not so sure about her when she laughed, and then her father worried him. The fiery old Southerner had the temper of the devil when roused. He could see that this second daughter was his favorite. He had caught the look of unreasonable anger and jealousy in his eye only that afternoon when they rode away together. Still, he must risk it. He had really suggested this sunset scene for that purpose. The field was his own choosing. Only a coward could run now. He managed at last to get his lips to work. "Since you came, Miss Sarah, I've been seeing life at a new angle." He paused awkwardly. The red blood mounted to her cheeks. "You've given me new eyes." She turned her head away. There was no mistaking the tremor of his tones. She was too honest to simper and pretend. Her heart was pounding so loudly, she wondered if he could hear. He fumbled nervously with his glove, glanced at her from the corner of his eye, and his voice sank to a whisper. I love you, Sarah." She turned slowly and looked at him through dimmed eyes. "And I love you." She paused, brushed a tear from her cheek, and with sweet reproach quietly added, "Why didn't you tell me sooner? We've lost so many beautiful days that might have been perfect." He suddenly stooped and kissed her full lips. "We'll not lose any more." "The world is beautiful, isn't it, dear?" she said, nestling closer. "Since I see you with your eyes, yes. It was only a place to fight in before. Now it's a fairy world, and these wild flowers that cover the plains only to grow to make a carpet for the feet of the girl I love." "A fairy world, yes," she whispered. "It's been just that to me since I first sang the fairy bells for you. I'll never love another song as that," he said reverently. "Nor I," was the low response. "My heart will beat to the music forever. It just means you now." For a long time they had sat without words, holding one another's hand. The sun hung a glowing ball of fire on the rim of the faraway hills, and the shadows of the valley deepened into twilight. "How wonderful the silence of the plains," the lover sighed. "Used to press me." The man nodded. "Now I hear the beat of angels' wings and know that God is near." "Because we love." And she laughed for joy. Again they sat in sweet, brooding silence. A horseman rode over the hilltop in the glow of the fading sun. From its summit he lifted his hand and waved a salute. They looked below, and in the doorway of the cabin a young mother stood, a babe in her arms, answering with hand uplifted high above her child. "What does it matter, dear?" she whispered. "A cabin or a palace?" Part 9. War. Side by side through the still white light of the full moon they rode home, in each heart the glow of the wonder and joy of love's first revelation. Words were an intrusion. The eyes of the soul were seeing now the hidden things of life. The gleam of the lights at the fort brought them sharply out of dreamland into the world of fact. "You must see my father tonight, dear," she said eagerly. "Must I tonight? It's best. I'd rather face 100 red men in war paint." A merry laugh was her answer as she leaned close. "Don't be silly. He likes you." "But he loves you." "Of course, and for that reason my happiness will be his." "God knows I hope so," was the doleful response. "But if I must, I must. I'll see him." A quiet kiss in the friendly shadows, and she was gone. He walked alone an hour after supper, screwing up his courage to the point of bearding the colonel in his den. He fumbled the doorbell at last, his heart in his throat. Old Rough and Ready was not inclined to help him. In his embarrassment, never had he seen the lines of his strong jaw or more set when he grunted. "Sit down, sir. Don't stand there and staring. I'm not on inspection." The perspiration started on his forehead, and he moistened his dry lips. "I beg your pardon, Colonel. I was a little flustered. I've something on my mind. Out with it." I'm in love with Miss Sarah." "You don't say." "Yes, sir." "Well, it's news to me. The whole family have been enjoying the affair for some time. I suppose you're asking, or think you're asking, for my daughter's hand in marriage?" "That's it. Yes, sir. Exactly. I guessed as much. I'm glad to tell you, young man, that I've always had the kindest feelings for you personally. Thank you, sir. And the warmest admirations for your talent as an officer. You're a good soldier. You have brains, you have executive ability, you're a leader of men. You'll go far in your profession. Thank you, sir. And that's why I don't want you as a son-in-law. What? I love my daughter, and I want her to be happy in a real home with a real husband and children by her side. A soldier's life is a dog's life. I've pitied the poor girl who gave up her home for me. Many a bitter tear has she shed over my absence and torturing dread of the next letter from the frontier. He paused and sprang to his feet. 100 times I've sworn no daughter of mine should ever marry a soldier. The better the soldier, the more reason she should not marry him. But, sir, there is no but about it, the colonel thundered. You're asking me to let you murder my girl, that's all. But it's life. I'll have to give my consent and wish you luck, long life, and all the happiness you can get out of a soldier's lot. The colonel extended his hand, and the lieutenant grasped it with grateful eagerness. The days that followed were red-lettered in the calendar of life, and then it came, a crash of thunder out of the clear sky, the thing he had somehow felt and dreaded. A petty court-martial was called to adjust a question of army discipline. The court was composed of Zachary Taylor, colonel commanding, Major Thomas F. Smith, a fiery-tempered, gay officer of the old army, Lieutenant Jefferson Davis, and the new second lieutenant who had just arrived from the Jefferson barracks at St. Louis. The Army regulations required that each officer sitting in court-martial should be in full uniform. The new arrival from St. Louis had come without his uniform. His trunk had miscarried and was returned to the Jefferson barracks. He rose with embarrassment. I must beg the pardon of the court, Colonel, he began cautiously, for not appearing in my uniform. As it is in St. Louis, I respectfully ask to be excused today from wearing it. The old colonel scowled. It was just like a young fool to wish to sit in solemn judgment on a fellow officer in his shirt sleeves. If he had asked to be excused from serving on the court, yes, he could accept his excuse and let him go. But this insolence was unbearable. The colonel glanced over the court before putting the question to vote. Smith was his enemy. Whichever way he voted as president, the major could be depended on to go against his decision. There was a feud between these two hot-tempered fire-eaters which lasted for years. He glanced at his future son-in-law with a smile of assured victory. Tom Smith would vote against him, but the trembling youngster who had quailed before him that night asking for his daughter's hand was practically in the family. He smiled at the certainty of downing Smith once more. In a voice whose tones left nothing to the imagination of the presumptuous second lieutenant, the colonel growled, Gentlemen, we are asked to allow an officer to sit in formal judgment of a court-martial without uniform. I put the question to a vote and cast mine. No. I vote yes, shouted the major. The colonel did not condescend to look his way. He knew what that vote was before he heard it. He bent his piercing eyes on the future son-in-law. Lieutenant Davis. There was just a moment's hesitation. The lieutenant smiled at the embarrassed young fellow officer and mildly answered, I think, Colonel, in view of the distance to St. Louis, we may excuse the young man for his first offense. I vote yes. The colonel stared at him in speechless amazement. Smith grinned. The colonel's face grew purple with rage. He was just able to gasp his words during the progress of the trial. It was brief, and when it ended, the rest had gone. He faced the lieutenant with blazing eyes. How dare you, sir, vote with that damned fool against me? Why, I never thought to hurt you, Colonel. No? And what did you think? I only thought of relieving the evident embarrassment of a young officer. You did, huh? No thought of me or my feelings or my wishes. You're a hell of a son-in-law, you are. He paused for breath and choked with rage no words could express. When at last his tongue found speech, he swore an oath more expressive and profound than modern man had ever dreamed. He damned the court, he damned Tom Smith, he damned the second lieutenant, He damned the regiment. He damned the government that created it. He damned the Indians that called it to the plains. He damned the world, all in it and all things under it. But particularly and specifically, he damned the young ass who dared to flaunt his feelings and opinions after smiling in his face at his house for days and weeks and months. Finally, facing the blushing lieutenant, his eyes flashed indignant scorn as he shouted, "No man who votes with that damned fool like Tom Smith can marry my daughter. Colonel, I protest," pleaded the heartsick lover. "I forbid you to ever put your foot inside my quarters again." "Colonel, silence, sir. I forbid you to ever speak to my daughter again. But, Colonel, I repudiate you and all yours. I wipe you from the map. You don't exist. I don't know you. I never knew you. Get out of my sight." The tall, slender form slowly straightened, and a look of cold pride shot from the depths of his blue eyes. Without a word, he turned and left. Part 10, Romance. Black Hawk was leading his red warriors in a great uprising. A wave of fierce excitement swept the frontier. There was stern work now for men to do, and women must wait alone. The regiment marched to the front. The colonel, as a man, was freezingly normal. As an officer, Zachary Taylor knew his worth and relied on it in every emergency. The state of Illinois had raised 2 companies of raw recruits to join in subduing the Indians. The colonel sent his most efficient subordinate to swear in the new soldiers. On the morning of the muster, there appeared before the tall lieutenant a man full 3 inches taller and famous in his county as the gawkiest, slab-sidest, homeliest, best-natured fellow in the state. He was dressed in a suit of blue jeans. "I am the captain of this company," and he waved his long arm toward the crowd of his countrymen on the right. Lieutenant Jefferson Davis promptly administered to Abraham Lincoln his first oath to support the Constitution and laws of the United States. 2 men destined to immortal fame had met and passed with scarcely a glance at each other. The young army officer was too much of a gentleman to mark the ill-fitting blue jeans of the awkward captain of the militia. Great events, after all, make men great. Only the eye of God could foresee the coming tragedy in which these 2 would play their mighty roles. At the end of the brief struggle on the frontier, Black Hawk's people were scattered to the 4 winds, and the brave old warrior, with a handful of his men, sought Colonel Taylor's command to surrender. Again the colonel sent his most accomplished officer, the lieutenant, whom he had forbidden to enter his house, to treat with the fallen chief. The lieutenant received with kindly words the broken-hearted warrior, his 2 sons, and 60 braves, and conducted them at once as prisoners of war to the barracks at St. Louis. The cholera was raging at Rock Island, and on the boat 2 of the Indian prisoners were seized with the fatal disease. The lieutenant, at the risk of his life, personally ministered to their needs. The 2 stricken men made known to the commander in broken words and signs that they had sworn an oath of eternal friendship. In pleading tones, the stronger said, "We beg the good chief to put us ashore, that hand in hand we may go to the happy hunting grounds together." Near the first little settlement their prayer was granted. The young officer turned to his boat with a sigh as he saw the red warriors slip their arms around each other and slowly sink to the ground to die alone and unattended. Old Black Hawk sat in silent, stolid indifference to his fate until the curious settlers began to crowd on the boat and stare at his misery. The lieutenant interfered with sharp decision. "Push those men back, Corporal," he ordered angrily. The crowd was roughly pushed back, and the lieutenant took Black Hawk kindly by the arm and led him into a reserved apartment where he was free from vulgar eyes. The old man's lips tightened. He gazed at the officer steadily and spoke in measured tones. "The young war chief treats me with much kindness. He is good and brave. He puts himself in my place and sees all that I suffer. With him I am much pleased." The lieutenant bowed and left him under the protection of a guard. Courtesy to a fallen foe in the old days was the first obligation of an officer and gentleman. In the autumn, Colonel Taylor again sent his lieutenant on a distant duty, this time one of particular danger. He was ordered to Louisville and Lexington on recruiting service, and the cholera was known to be epidemic but a few miles from Lexington. The goodbye scene that night at the lovers' trysting place, the little tent reception room of the McCraes, was long, tender, and solemn. "Oh, I feel dreadful about this trip, dear," his sweetheart kept repeating with pitiful despair that refused to be comforted. "You must be brave, Moan," he answered with a frown. "A soldier's business is to die. I am a soldier. I go where duty calls. To battle, yes. But this black pestilence that comes in the night, I'm afraid. I just can't help it, I'm afraid. I've always had a horror of such things. I have a presentiment that you'll die that way. Presentiments and dreams go by opposites. I'll live to a ripe old age." She looked into his face with a tender smile. "You think so?" "Yeah. Why not?" "Well, I've got something to tell you." She paused, and the man bent low. "What?" "I've made a vow to God," the voice stopped with a sob, "that if he will only send you back safely to me this time, I'll wait no longer on my father's whim. I am yours." The lover clasped her trembling form to his heart. "Goodbye, dearest," he said at last. "I wish to go with that promise ringing in my soul." 10 days after he reached Lexington, the cholera broke out and hundreds fled. He stood by his men, watched their diet, nursed the sick, and buried the dead. He helped the carpenter make the coffins and reverently bore the victims to their graves. No fear was in his soul. Love was chanting the anthem of life. A strange new light was burning in the eyes of the woman he loved on the day he returned in safety. She seized his hand and spoke with decision. "Come with me." Her father was standing at the gate. She faced him, holding defiantly the hand of her lover. The old man saw and understood. His jaw was set with sullen determination, and his face hardened. "We have waited 2 long years," she began softly. "We have been patient and hopeful, but you have given no sign. My lover's character is beyond reproach, and I am proud of him. I am sorry to cross you, Father, but I've made up my mind. I'm going to marry him now." The colonel turned in silence and slowly walked into the house. Captain McRae engaged a stateroom for her on the boat for Louisville. The lovers planned to meet at her aunt's, the colonel's oldest sister. The tearful goodbyes had been said to mother and sisters and brother. The colonel had not spoken, but he had business on the boat before she cast her lines from the shore. The daughter drew him into her stateroom and slipped her arms around his neck. Few words were spoken, and they were broken. "Please, Father, please. I love you, please." "No." "I'm no longer a child. I'm a woman. You're a real man, and you should know. I could have no respect for myself if I should yield my life's happiness to a whim." The old colonel stroked her shoulder. "I understand you chip off the old block. You're just stubborn as I am, and I won't eat my words." With a firm hand he drew away and hurried from the boat. The Taylor clan of Kentucky gathered for the wedding in force. The romance appealed to their fancy. They loved the high-spirited, self-poised little kinswoman, and they liked the tall, modest young officer she had chosen for her husband. The stern old colonel was not there, but his brother and 3 sisters and all of their tribe made merry at the wedding feast. On the deck of the lazy river steamer, the bride and groom slowly drifted down the moonlit, shimmering way to the fields of Mississippi. The bride nestled close to her lover's side, and the long, sweet silence is too deep for words. He took her hand at last and said tenderly, "I've something very important to tell you now, my dear. I'm not afraid. You trust me implicitly, perfectly. You have given up all for me," he went on evenly. "I'll show your father what I can do for you." "You love me. It's enough." "No. I've resigned my commission in the army. I've given up my career. We'll live only for each other now and build our nest in the far sunny south, beyond the frost line." A little smothered cry was her answer, and then her head slowly sank with a sob on his breast. Part 11, The Fairy Bells. They built their home on the banks of the great river where the tide sweeps in graceful curve, all but completing the circle of an enchanted isle. From the little flower-veiled porch, through festoons of lacing boughs, gleamed the waters of the huge curved mere. Held by nature's hand, the music from the decks of the steamers floated up on the soft air until music and perfume of flowers seemed one. In the cool of the mornings, on swift, high-bred horses, they rode side by side along the river's towering bluff and laughed in sheer joy at their foolish happiness. In the waning afternoon, hand in hand, they walked in the sunlit fields and paused at dusk to hear the songs of the slaves. The happiness of lovers is contagious. It sets the hearts of slaves to singing. In the white solemn splendor of the southern moon they strolled through enchanted paths of scented roses. On the rustic seat beneath a magnolia in full second bloom they listened to the song of a mockingbird whose mate had built her nest in the rose trellis beside their door. They could count the beat of his bird heart night after night as he sang the glory of love and the beauty of his coming brood of young. "You are happy, dearest?" the lover sighed. "In heaven I am with you, and it shall be forever." "Forever?" "The old life of blood and strife, it seems an ugly dream, except for the sweet days when you were near. This only is life, my dear, to hold your hands and to walk this way together, to build, not to destroy, to make flowers bloom, birds and slaves sing, to create, not kill. Production is communion with God. We live now in peace that passeth understanding." A long silence followed. An owl in a distant treetop gave a shrill, plaintive cry. The bride nestled closer, and he felt her shiver. "You are chilled, dearest?" "Just a little. We're not forgetting the late August night winds." "No, it's nothing. I'm just a wee bit afraid of an owl, that's all." A dark figure slowly approached and stood with uncovered head. "What is it, James?" the master asked. "Too late, sir, for you and the missus. Be out this air. It's chill and fever time." "Thank you, James. We'll go in at once." When the faithful footfalls had died away, the lover lifted his bride in his arms and carried her in, while she softly laughed and clung to his strong young shoulders. It came with swift, sure tread, the silent white figure of the pestilence that walks in tropic splendor. The lover laughed the doctor's fears to scorn, and the old man was brave and cheerful in the presence of youth and happiness. James Pemberton followed him to the gate and held his horse's bridle with a tremor in his black hand. "You don't think, doctor," he paused, afraid to say, "you don't think my young missus is going to die?" "She's very ill, Jim. It's an even fight for life." "If she do, it'll kill my young massa." "Soldiers can't die that way, no." "Yassa, but they ain't been married but 3 months, sir, and he done worship very ground her little foot walk on. She just can't die. She too young and putty, sir. It naturally can't be." The doctor's gray head slowly moved, as if in remembrance of tragic scenes. Death loves a shining mark sometimes. He turned to the slave in tones of warning. "Watch your massa closely." "By massa, sir." "He'll go down next." "Yassa, yassa." 2 days later, the strong man collapsed with a crash that took even the experienced old doctor by surprise. An iron will had bent over the bedside of his bride and fought with grim defiance the battle with unseen foe until the last ounce of strength had gone. In his delirium, they moved him to another room, and he awoke to find himself in a prison cell on a desert island 1,000 miles from the mate he adored. He watched the jailers, and at last his hour came. The tired guard beside his prison pallet slept. With fevered stealth he rose, and with the strength of a giant bent the bars of his cage and crawled and fought his way over the hill and valley, rock and mountains, back to the bedside of his beloved. He paused in rapture at the door. She was sitting up in bed, the pillows propped behind her back, singing their favorite song, Fairy Bells. How soft and weirdly sweet her voice, its notes so far away and plaintive. Never had she sung so divinely. He held his breath lest a word or quiver of its melody should be lost, and then he slipped his strong arms around her and looked into her eyes, shining with unearthly beauty. "You have come at last, my own." She sighed. "I knew the bells would call you." "Yes, dearest, and I'll never leave you again. They took me away, a wounded prisoner of war, but I broke the bars and came when I heard you call." "Look," she whispered, pointing with the slender blue-veined figure. "There she is in the doorway again, with her baby in her arms, waving at sunset to her lover on the hill. What does it matter, a cabin or a palace?" The shining eyes grew dim, the figure drooped, and a wild, piteous cry came from the lover's fevered lips. "Lord God of love and pity, she's dying. Help! Help!" His faithful servant, worn with watching day and night, heard the cry, rushed to his side, and caught his fainting form as the light of the world faded. Part 12. Truth. They nursed him slowly back into life again, the loving heart of the older brother guiding the arm of his faithful slave. He refused to live at first. "It's no use, Joe," he cried with bitter despair. "Life isn't worth the struggle anymore. I've decided I just want to rest by her side, that's all. I know, boy, how you feel, but you must live. Duty calls. Great events are stirring the world. You have a man's part to play. I won't play it. I'm done with ambitions. I'm done with strife. The game's not worth the candle. I've lived the only life worth living, and it's finished." Little by little, each day the brother slowly rebuilt in the stricken soul the will to live. Before he was able to walk, he lifted the frail form in his arms, carried him into his big library, and seated him in an armchair before a fire of glowing logs. With a sweep of his arm about the room toward the crowded shelves, he began in earnest tones. "You're going to live with me now, boy. We love each other with the love of strong men. I need your help and companionship in my study. You've had the advantage of a college career, and I didn't. We'll master here these records of the world's life. We'll seek wisdom in the history and experience of man. What do you know of the treasures buried in these big volumes? Our young men go to school and plunge into life with a mere smattering. Do you know the history of your own country, how it was discovered, how its colonies grew, how its battles were fought against overwhelming and impossible odds, how its great constitution grew in the hands of inspired leaders who built it better than they knew, a chart for the guidance of man? Do you know the history of the mind of man? Do you know the story of those ragged, bleeding feet of the great thinkers of ages who found the paths of truth through blood and tears and then walked away to the stake, to the block and the gallows? Come with me into the big world of the past. Read, study, think, and gird yourself with power. We're just entering on the struggle that means life or death to our republic. I believe, as I believe in God, that we have set a beacon light on the shores of the world that will guide the human race to its mightiest achievements, unless we fail to keep its lantern trimmed and bright. The poison of indolence is in our blood, the tendency to centralize tyranny. We are but a few years removed from its curse. As we grow in years, the temptation to make Washington the gilded capital of an empire becomes more and more apparent. Unless we control this tendency to lapse into the past, we are lost, and the story of our fallen republic will be but one more added to the failures of history. Unless we can preserve the sovereignty of our states, the Union will become an empire, not a republic of republics. It's a difficult thing for men to govern themselves, though they can do it better than anyone else has ever done it for them. We are making this wonderful experiment here in the New World. The fate of unborn millions hangs on its success. You're done with self and self-seeking. Ambition is a dream that is past. Good. Lay your life in unselfish sacrifice on the altar of your country. Only a man who has given up ambition is fit for great leadership. He alone dares to seek and know and speak the truth. The tired spirit rose with a new view of human life, its aim and purpose. For 8 years he buried himself in the library on his brother's estate. Through the long winter nights, the two brilliant minds fought over in friendly contest the battle of the ages, until the passion for truth grew into one purpose of a great soul. When the first rumblings of the storm, it was to shake a continent, broke over the Republic, he stepped forth to take his hand in the world of action. The best equipped, most thoroughly trained, most perfectly poised man who had ever entered the arena of American politics. His rise was brilliant and unprecedented. In his first contest, he met the foremost orator of his age, Sergeant Prentice, and vanquished him on his own ground. In 2 years he took his seat in Congress, the favorite son of Mississippi. He had scarcely begun his career as a lawmaker when war was declared against Mexico. He resigned his high office, raised a regiment, and once more found himself a soldier under the orders of stern old Zachary Taylor. On his first battlefield at the head of the Mississippi Regiment, he planted the flag of the Republic on the Grand Plaza of Monterey. And in the supreme crisis of the Battle of Buena Vista, with the blood streaming from his wounds, he led his men in a charge against overwhelming odds, turned the tide from defeat to victory, and gave the presidency to the man who had denied him to his daughter's hand. He hobbled back on crutches to his brother's home in Mississippi, amid the shouts and frenzied acclaim of a proud and grateful people. Within 3 years from the day he entered public life, He took his seat in the Senate chamber of the United States beside Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, the peer of any man within its walls, and with the conscious power of knowledge and truth, girded himself for the coming struggle of giants. End of the prologue.